So welcome to this evening's soiree. You are mostly familiar faces, but just in case, my name is Ellen Mutter, and I am the arts coordinator for the Arts at Amherst Initiative. The initiative is a partnership between the Mead Art Museum and the Departments of Art and the History of Art, Music, and Theater and Dance. And the initiative works to foster a collaborative, interdisciplinary arts community at Amherst. Part of this work includes providing funding to Amherst faculty and staff in support of cross-disciplinary arts-centered programming. And so I want to draw everyone's attention to our upcoming funding deadline, which is next Friday, February 19th. And do reach out if you have any questions about that application process. It's pretty relaxed, but happy to help. The work of the steering committee, or the work of the initiative, is administered by a rotating steering committee. And this year, in addition to me, the steering committee members are Daryl Harper, Danielle Amadeo, Jenna Regal, and Dwight Carey. As I introduce this evening's event, I welcome you all to get comfortable in your spaces with and without wine. It was really lovely to see so many of you who registered early and elected to pick up a bottle of wine and cheese. It was a very fun part of my job this week to see you all. Some logistics for tonight's event, a reminder that I'm recording. Each of our speakers will each present their recent research, and then following that, we'll open up to an audience Q&A. Feel free to message me or the other moderator, Danielle, throughout the conversation with questions, or you can message the whole group, and I will read these questions out during the Q&A. If you'd like to ask the question yourself, you can just raise your virtual or real hand and I'll call on you and you can unmute yourself. And now, introducing tonight's guests. I had the lovely pleasure of speaking with both of them on Monday, and I'm really excited to hear both of their talks. We have Kate Pukinskis, who is in the first of her 2 years as the Valentine Visiting Assistant Professor of Music. Kate is teaching 2 courses this spring, an Intro to Music course and an upper level composition seminar. And this evening, she'll be talking about her role as a composer and how it informs her scholarly research, as well as how the field of ethnomusicology and her research in ethnomusicology feeds into her compositions. And our second speaker is Miloslava Hruba, and she is the Mead Art Museum Study Room Manager and European Print Specialist. And the work she'll be sharing tonight comes from research she conducted during a June 2019 sabbatical project. And she'll be sharing the printmaking traditions in the former Czechoslovakia during the period from World War II until the fall of communism. And now I'm happy to hand off to our first speaker, Kate.
Thanks, Ellen. Thanks so much for having me. And I'm excited to see some familiar faces and also some new ones. I think being a first-year faculty member during a pandemic is a little weird because I would have normally, in a perfect world, come into contact with a lot of you by now. So it's great to see some new faces and hopefully get some conversations started. So there are 2 big connecting threads in my work. The first is how complex systems work and interact with one another. And the second is a subset of that, a curiosity about how stories and ideas travel and evolve, are protected and expanded as they meet new bodies and voices. Talking about composing for me always involves talking about my personal life and experience. I've settled into being a composer who relies heavily on their lived experience to fuel and inspire their work, and to be transparent about that in program notes or presentations like these. As I continue to grow and work more, I've come to realize that I tend to carry a memory or a person or a story with me in the process of writing a new piece. It isn't that I'm implanting my relationship with them or my experience directly into the work or telling that story, but each new piece tends to push me towards memories of someone or something that I've known or wished that I had known. Perhaps I think about them more as I'm composing, or the process of writing that music or working with that text leads me to them in some way. This residue is also what fuels my research and my teaching. These things all end up mixing together, and sometimes it's hard to know which thing came from where. But tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about how composing, research, and being Latvian work together for me. I think I started to come into my own voice as a composer around the same time that I really got into my research on Latvian choral traditions, which started during my graduate studies. As a composer, I had, for the most part, been following along and writing the things that I assumed were expected of me in my PhD program, either from my teacher or because of my level of study or the institution with which I was affiliated. Sometimes these assumptions were highly misinformed or misinterpreted on my part. I had a particularly complicated relationship with my composition teachers at the beginning of my PhD, where I was writing outside my own style in order to find their approval. It was miserable. I was miserable. The light of those early years, though, were my studies in ethnomusicology. I had always been curious about how people made music, why, what happens when they make it together, how it changes over time. And ethnomusicology was a place where I could explore those curiosities. It also allowed me to fold elements of my own identity into my research, much like I was aching to do in my work as a composer. A quick bit of background. My paternal grandmother left Latvia in the autumn of 1944 with her 2-year-old daughter, Inessa, my aunt. My grandfather went in a different direction, simultaneously fighting in and dodging the ends of the Second World War. My father was born in an American displaced persons camp in Germany in 1948, and his younger brother was born in the United States in 1957. As a kid in the 80s and 90s, my parents sang a Latvian lullaby to me every night before I went to bed, and we still sing a Latvian birthday song to one another on family birthdays. We used to bake Latvian gingerbread cookies at Christmas time in the basement reception hall of the Latvian church that my grandfather built in Willimantic, Connecticut. I grew up hearing older family members speak Latvian, and I knew enough to say thank you and I love you when dinner's ready, but developed an interest in my heritage only after my grandmother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Many of her life stories passed with her in 2010, but those years also woke up my curiosities about my heritage. Going to Latvia for the first time in 2013 opened up a lot for me. Part of the joy of that experience was that it was a research trip, but also that it was actually the first time my dad was able to go to Latvia as well. It was an incredibly emotional experience to watch him return to a place that he had never actually been, but finally felt like he belonged. He often expressed to me that he never quite felt like he belonged in America, but also didn't feel like he had the right to claim his identity as Latvian because he hadn't ever lived there. It was during this visit that I think he finally felt like a place was familiar to him and to his genetic code. Something about the trees and the people and the roads and the food all just cinched together around him. Much of my research in Latvia is about their Dziesmu Svētki, or song celebration. It's held every 5 years since 1873. This week-long event celebrates traditional Latvian folk song, dance, costume, storytelling, and music. It features a mix of traditional folk, academic, and popular music, a beautiful and sometimes precarious balance of tradition and modernity. I'm going to play a quick clip of the concert from 2018, which was the most recent festival. I'll share my screen, but I'm also going to drop the link in the chat for you if you'd prefer to go through your own internet channels. And I'll just play a minute or so you can get a sense of how things look and sound at this festival. Whoop. Hold on one second. Technology. There we go. I mean, we could stop right there and just talk about like, what does a choir of 18,000 people sound like? And how do you make that work? And there's 75,000 people in the audience there. And so it's just, I mean, it's the coolest thing. My husband went in 2018 with me, and I had been talking about it, you know, since we had started dating into getting married. And he was like, I thought I knew because of the way you talked about it. And then I went, and I was like, I had no idea. So this is the song celebration. This is sort of where my research starts. And my early projects centered around the use of certain songs from the national choral canon during the Soviet occupation of Latvia as a tool for maintaining a sense of community and Latvian culture. My work was a hybrid of archival work and analytical study, trying to figure out what the actual construction of a composition did to help make the music accessible and usable for the purposes of fortifying cultural identity or for nonviolent political protest. It was very much a meeting place for my curiosities about composing and ethnomusicology. In my early visits to Latvia, I became curious also about the navigation of tradition and modernity. At nearly 150 years old, the Song Festival has been evolving in each iteration to meet the needs of Latvians and the evolution of Latvian music. Any progress and change comes with friction, bureaucracy, some risk taking. So I became curious about how singers navigate the history and tradition of these pieces and their present day iterations. I'm actually presenting a paper at a conference tomorrow afternoon that draws on performances of a piece from 1985 and then the same piece again in 2018, tracking how the story of it or its sonic footprint evolves and takes on new meaning in each performance. That piece that I'm talking about tomorrow in particular is a data point at a crossroads. It's a clear nod to tradition, but how it's used and conducted and programmed also has the potential to really shift its meaning and cultural weight going forward. My other current research in the Latvian choral traditions is circling back to more analytical approaches and thinking about ways in which this untapped musical resource can help push the current practices of music theorists and choral singers beyond Latvia and the Latvian choral tradition. In celebrating Latvia's centenary in 2018, a commissioning project yielded 80 some odd new works for unaccompanied choir written by living Latvian composers and celebrating the pre-national pagan tenets of the culture. The project that I'm doing takes a few of these new pieces as case studies to start a discussion about how we might approach music theory and analysis of new unaccompanied choral music, which is highly underexplored in the music theory sphere of things. It prioritizes the experience of learning or leading or singing the piece as the impetus for these approaches. So thinking about the analytical work that musicians are doing when they're responsible for the premiere of a new piece or in the learning process to prepare for performance. So it takes this pre-performance work and continues it through as possible techniques for post-performance exploration. In Latvia, back in my first trips and in my continued visits there and research, I found a convergence of my research interests and heritage, that there was a way for me to pursue rigorous scholarship in something that was personally important to me. It also opened up a similar application in composition, that I could pursue rigorous creative output that was a more honest reflection of my identity, exploring my own kind of storytelling and writing music. Perhaps my biggest takeaway for both the scholarship and composing sides of things is that my personal investment in the work was not a thing to hide from, but something I could use to help fuel and inspire more. Doing research in Latvia also helped make space for exploring where my own Latvianness fits into my work as a composer. Sometimes the connection is clear, like in a setting of songs from my childhood. So that birthday song that I mentioned in the lullaby, and then another folk song I set for baritone voice and piano. And so that's one sort of way there's a direct connection there. Sometimes I take a text by a Latvian poet and set it for a choir or for a vocal ensemble of some kind. Sometimes it's my own excavation of these abstract tenets of folk song that have come really directly from my research and thinking about ways I can grasp onto those really abstract ideas and fold them into my 21st century experiences and work as a composer. There are also other times when I take elements of my actual lineage to inspire pieces. So a composition like Drift, which I wrote for soprano and flute back in 2018, explores my memories of the fragmenting of my grandmother's memory. She lived with us for a time during those 10 years from her Alzheimer's diagnosis to her passing. And so I found avenues to explore my literal and emotional processing of that experience in my composition. I think I want to play, though, for you, the lullaby that I heard every night and that I found a way to put into a setting of these folk songs. So it's the third movement of a set, and I'll put the link here in the chat, but I'll also play it for you and show the text on the screen. But just to set it up, the piece that you'll hear was from 2015. I wrote it, the first version of it, in 2008 or 2009 while I was a graduate student. And the early versions were fine, but they sort of lacked the kind of emotional pull that I was hoping for. So in the birthday song, I really wanted to really dig into this feeling of like a raucous celebration. And in the second movement, I really wanted to dig into this like dark sense of pulling downward. If anybody's ever read the book The Phantom Tollbooth, thinking of like the doldrums was part of what I was getting into. And then in the third one, the lullaby, I really wanted to tap into the sense of adventure that comes at the point of falling asleep when you're a kid, right? That going off into your dreams is a point where a whole set of possibilities and worlds open up. And so that it was both peaceful, but then also full of potential energy. And I just, in 2009, when I wrote them, I didn't quite get it then. And I don't know if it's time or time spent in Latvia or just getting used to my own voice and sort of getting better at composing. But the iterations that happened in 2015 are much more satisfying to me. So I'm just gonna play through the third of these three songs, which is called Aya Juju, and I'll share the link is in the chat, but I'll also share it, and I'll play the audio and then also show you all the composer's note in here, not my email, just trying to move that, and then the translation. So it's about 5.5 minutes long, and this is for baritone and piano, recorded live. So. So, in taking so long to realize that I could be in my music however I wanted to be, I also recognize that there aren't a lot of environments in the academy where people who didn't quite align with whatever the current or historical trend was could feel like there was space for them. This really ignited in me a desire to think about ways I could advocate for those mirrors and spaces for people in the work I do as a teacher and a composer and a scholar. And I started to take on more projects that engaged issues or ideas with which I identify, which maybe aren't so common in the concert hall. Just this past weekend, the second piece in a series or long-term project I'm working on was premiered by the Radcliffe Choral Society, the Treble Voice Choir at Harvard University, and the Parker String Quartet was accompanying them on the piece. It's a two-movement work, I set text excerpted from a dissent and an opinion written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg while she was a justice on the Supreme Court. And working with texts that wouldn't normally find their way into a concert conversation is something that I've really enjoyed folding into my work. Trying to find a topic or an author that is unfamiliar to the typical concert audience, or conversely, working to collaborate with ensembles who wouldn't normally program new music have become really important parts of my life and my work. The RBG project is a huge artistic challenge for me, working with a text that was not pointing towards artful delivery at all, and crafting or carving out language that sits well in the voice has really pushed me as a music maker. Further, it's a challenge in some ways to remove the political opinion out of the language and really tap into the more artful and general or human or basic tenets. This could go down a significant rabbit hole, totally unrelated. I do want to respect the time, and so I know we're running out, but I'm going to just drop this in the chat for later if anybody is curious about the work. And RCS did a great thing where they collaborated with some local young artists to make art to accompany the video of the performance, which was also a really fun and interesting and new way to think about ways that we can engage with our communities and audience. 20 minutes is just enough time to plant some seeds and start some small fires in a presentation like this, but I'm happy to dig further into any of the ideas I brought up this evening. Thanks so much for your time and attention. And I look forward to having a discussion with you all after Mila's presentation.
Thank you so much, Kate. I'm so excited for the continued conversation. Yeah, Mila, why don't you go ahead and share your screen when you're ready?
I'm getting there. Okay. And I'll put this down. And here we go. I would first like to thank you, Alan, for bringing Kate and myself together and kind of also putting us in a place that we are both very familiar, which is the Central East part of Europe, known as the Eastern Europe. So it's nice to actually hear some beautiful choral music from Latvia, which is one of the 3 Baltic countries that I'm not going to be talking about today in my very quick presentation, which I like to call more like field notes. I will be talking about printmaking in just 2 countries in what used to be known as the former Eastern European bloc. But I also thought that for the introduction, what might be good is actually to start with a personality that was very much on the front to liberate the countries from the communist regime, and that person is Václav Havel, that some of you might be familiar with, the great playwright, writer, humanist, and also the former president of Czechoslovakia and later Czech Republic. I will cite, hope is not a conviction that something will turn out well, but certainly that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. it is also this hope above all that gives us the strength to live and continually to try new things, even in the conditions that seems as hopeless as ours do here and now. Well, you see the date when this was written at the mid 1980s, but I had this quotation always sort of in my books, and I thought that it was quite appropriate for contemporary situation, and it's sort of a quote that we can always take to our heart and hope, and sometimes it will turns good. Let me start just very geographically to orient you. These are the two countries I will be speaking about: the Czechoslovakia, which used to be until 1990 Czech and Slovak Socialist Republic, being put together in a federal republic. I also, during my research, and I should say it was just not quite 5 weeks in 2019, when I had a staff sabbatical, and I decided to take it and try to bring some knowledge about this geographical area and artistic practice in with regards to the museum collection that we have at the Mead. So I went to Slovenia as well, and I'll mention later on the reasons why I decided to spend a few days there as well. So the reasons I decided to take this opportunity and go to Central East Europe was, first of all, my interest in printmaking. And but that also has a resonance with the collection of Russian avant-garde and nonconformist art that the Mead Art Museum has, as again many of you know, since 2001, when Amherst College alum Thomas Whitney gave it to the museum, along with a big archive. Collection of books and manuscripts in the Russian Center. And as you can see actually on the picture, though these are small objects, most of these works are from the first avant-garde of the Russian Russian artists, basically pre-Second World War. And there are some works which are mainly prints or works on paper, which would go under the categorization of the non-conformist or non-official dissident art that developed. The other reason why I sort of took a special focus or interest was to follow the role of women in arts, and so I developed further my focus along the gender roles. And one of the opportunities also I had to think about it a little more was a couple of years back, when I was one of the curators for the exhibition Fragmented Identities, Gender Roles of Women in Art Through the Ages. And I realized, as I think many museums are realizing, how little there is by women artists and what are the reasons. And I thought that focusing on the region of the former Soviet bloc would sort of expand also the canon of art history, and expand the thinking about gender roles and how they were put or how they were experienced under the shadows. That's why my title, Marking Its Shadows. And there are actually several layers of shadows for women artists as well, which I will continue about. The Mead Art Museum, by the way, does have some examples, and of course I would encourage you to take this opportunity and come to see us, and I'll be very happy as a study room manager to go to the storage and bring these works out for you. Kamila Štanclová and Andrea Pezman are the museum latest acquisitions, but we also have a couple of works by Lubomír Přibyl, who was a nonconformist Czech artist working mainly in abstract geometry. To my surprise, when I looked through the other regional museums, we do have the Smith Museum has more works, and by known artists, Jiří Kolář certainly is a name on the international stage. The Smith has two of his works, which are collages, so kiesmash. Again, there is a whole broad material that Jiří Kolář actually innovatively brought in the terminology and the canon of art history during the communist regime. Jiří Anderle and Jurovic are other works, and the lower Alena Kučerová in the middle of the landscape. I will speak about her a little more. She was one of my primary focus. And even more contemporary, Milena Dopitová, who is now at the top of her career, exhibited at the Venice Biennale and known and also represented by international galleries, even a gallery in New York. Sort of jumping here, but I said that I would mention a few words about my reasons going to Ljubljana in Slovenia, which is the former one of the republics of the former Yugoslavia. The reason was the Biennial of Graphic Art, which was very important festival of art for graphic art and other media of art. The festival was founded in 1955, and so it's a long tradition. But what was the most important was that Ljubljana became a meeting point for artists, because Ljubljana Slovenia is part of Yugoslavia, who was one of those non-aligned countries, so there was not as direct relationship or direct sort of directness from the former Soviet Union. So they were more, Yugoslavia had open borders, at least partially, with France, etc. So their artists could meet there, and even if they couldn't physically, they could send their works, and prints, being works of art on paper, could have been rolled up and sent there, so that they would get an attention of international curators or galleries. And this is also how some of the prints, even the ones that we have in the collections regionally, got through actually donors, and those then gave them to the museums. Robert Rauschenberg and his one of his first printmaking efforts was sent to the Biennale in 1963, got a Grand Prix. So I just picked Robert Rauschenberg for the fact that that really was a well-known festival, that wouldn't be just something that was happening somewhere in a little in the middle, somewhere in Eastern Europe. As I said, this trip was, or I consider certainly this presentation more as a field trip than, or field notes rather than a full-fledged presentation, research presentation. So these few slides will give you a little bit of feel of what it was to go through various storages and catalogs and all. Usually I didn't encounter, actually in most cases, that there were no digital catalogs, so I had to go through papers. So I didn't really know what to encounter, even though I knew works of those artists, but those storages are absolutely rich and wonderful, and I was led pretty much on my own and all. So this is for National Gallery in Prague. It was my little work table in a hallway. This slide with, anyway, this slide I included because of literature that was not readily available here, even through even through interlibrary services. So I had to actually go and get some of the books from curators' offices, which was interesting. This is one of the regional storages. Some of my trips were awesome because I got to know a little bit of the architecture of Czech-Slovak Republic. This is a wonderful Baroque castle in northern Bohemia, and I also through well, I was in contact with curators and galleries, etc. But also I was actually fortunate to meet one of the most prominent collectors in Czech Republic, who sort of developed his collecting taste from 19th century Czech to abstract art and mainly geometric art. And he has a collection of not only the Eastern or Central and Eastern artists, but also contemporary artists. And I won't dwell much about that because time is counting. When I was deciding what actually to bring to you from the relatively large group of artists, printmakers, I settled on 3, and then I will add 2 more, and then we'll see how we are doing on time. The seminal personality or the seminal artist of the 1950s is Vladimír Boudník, who represents through his body of prints the sort of the new avant-garde after the Second World War II, when and particularly after 1948, when the communists took in power and were the only art doctrine that could have been practiced was social realism. And Vladimír Boudník sort of cross or march right through the doctrines and all the also traditional artistic movements that were applied and practiced before the war, and became sort of this workers artist doing what he felt made sense and was new and should be understandable to all people, regardless of classes, regardless of political beliefs, etc. So I'll comment on it a little more in a little while. The second person or second artist I chose for you to see some examples of her work is Alena Kučerová, who is a living artist still. She's in her mid-80s, and I almost met her, but it didn't. Then in the end, it didn't work out. And she brought again she's a visual artist, but most of her works, or works that certainly are worth of mentioning, are prints that she innovatively brought into the audience of people. The third person, Naděžda Plíšková, she is the strongest artist personality working along sort of lines of feminism. And also, as you see from this picture, sort of you can, or there is a category that she could be put, which is pop art, which again is not just as we would read about it, like Warhol, etc. So Vladimír Boudník, as I said, he was about 24, 25 when he came up with a manifest, an art program called Explosionalism in 1949, where he saw art as sort of this fantasy or explosion of ideas that everyone has. And what he did was basically action painting. As you can see from the photographs here, he would set in Prague, on Prague streets, and somewhere with a hole which would be stained or damaged, and then he would start drawing, sort of working with what he saw, and kind of continuing according to his creativeness. What's interesting about it is that he would actually engage in communicating with people, with passerbys, kind of explaining his idea of art for all, art that everyone has in their body, in their mind, and he had a circle of friends. So this really, and later on, he even remarked on it when he learned about Pollock and all that. They were both doing the same thing, basically not knowing of each other. He also didn't, he did have some formal schooling, but he decided that for him, for kind of propagating his idea, he wanted to be among people. So he decided to go, he worked at a factory, and the factory became his studio. He otherwise lived very, very poorly, had a tiny little apartment. And what he started to do is to use what he had at work. So metal plates. By the way, he worked in a coal mine, but in a machinery workshop, and work with all kinds of metal and using appropriate tools. So he started to marked those metal plates, also sometimes cutting them, modeling them, and throughout his innovative and kind of original work with the material, he would be creating what now has been categorized as structural prints. These two are examples of it. Uh, Magnetic prints, this is actually one of the examples where he would not only put he would not only do marking in the metal, but he would also put on some parts, pieces of metal, or little parts of metal dust, and then glue them, but glue them not by a glue, but by fire. Sort of, it was a little chemical process, and the other thing that he would use was electromagnet that he would put under the plate, and then kind of gathered all those little tiny things, so that again it would be a creation of all possible stains and marks, and that was his art. And he also the factory became sort of an exhibition gallery for him. The sad thing about his personality was that he actually was not understood certainly not by the regime, but not only his fellow workers. They thought he was crazy. He was just, it didn't make sense. It wasn't, people didn't understand. People just were not, it was entertaining, but he was not really getting through people. However, he did have followers. He did have pupils, and there was a circle of sort of underground personalities, not only in art but also literary personalities, etc. So these variations of Rorschach's tests came from or were inspired by his stay in psychiatric hospital, where doctors had to examine him. This was the system sent him in the hospital and realized that he's perfectly fine. But his experience from all the various tests were these symmetrical prints that sort of visually remind or bring the idea of those Rorschach's tests that which were used for analyzing people. what he did too, he would use his plates and print them on pages from magazines, from books, call them derealizations, and the idea was to bring the images from sort of both platforms and let them sort of bring ideas, bring narratives, bring more, or inspire more visualizations. Alena Kučerová, as I mentioned, she is an artist who is still practicing. She went through a period of geometric abstraction, which on its own was forbidden art at the time of 1950s, 1960s, and certainly not ready for exhibiting, which, by the way, was the situation of these groups of artists. They were not exhibition places for them, for their art. Their exhibition places were their atelier, their studios, their flats, but no official places would allow that. Alena Kučerová, her innovativeness was again very much embedded in the plate, in the matrix. Again, shortage of material. So what she could use was metal, but very thin metal, like metal from cans that she could buy in like a hard store. And the perforation that she worked her plates were actually tools from her grandfather's cobbler workshop. So something that she could use, which again is another characteristics of artists, non-official or underground artists of that time. They did not have access to art materials as we can imagine, going to a store, buying what they needed, paper, tools, inks, paints, etc. Everything had to be obtained somehow through someone, or just go and kind of improvise. What also she introduced was the idea, or what she was sourcing out, where she was sourcing out her subjects were from the home, from her own home, the intimacy of, as we can see here in the print called Play, mother playing with her children, also water, being in a sand and playing, which sort of is a play or comment on the role of artists as mothers and the other role that they had to play in the society. Eventually in the 1970s and then into 1980s, she sort of focused, or her subject became a landscape that she delineated very very carefully through her punch work, and then the last sort of the shadows, and was done by just wiping the plate. So it almost had sort of an impressionistic effect, and one could think of prints of Rembrandt and sort of trying to put it in along some of the masters throughout the history. The detail, which is actually not a detail of the landscape from 1985, is she called those portraits of landscape. And again, this was also something she had as an artist around herself, limited resources, limited to know what's going on outside of her country, even of her city. So these were the inspiration that artists sometimes had to just take. But even if we're talking about landscape, by the culture institutions led and overlooked by communists. That was not what the regime wanted. It was too abstract. What you saw was too abstract for them. It didn't have people, it didn't have happy smiles, joyful playing, showing workers as the builders of the new future. Anyway, this is a picture of her printing a plate, so plate that that actually exists and in one of the collections. And those plates, when she, at the end of 1980, she sort of abandoned her punctured plate or that type of printmaking and just focused on the plates that she had dozens and dozens, and started to work with them and creating a artwork, creating sculptures, reliefs that she would sometimes paint, sometimes decorate with other natural elements, such as in the picture here. And as a woman and as an artist, which is an irony of her talent and her hopes and her work, is that after the changes in 1990s, where you would expect, and she did actually an exhibition, they prepared an exhibition for her in the City Gallery in Prague, but she was she was basically evicted from her studio in Prague by a new regime. Again, she is a personality that's been very she had a very complicated life, but interestingly enough, the new system sort of didn't really offer much of a satisfaction or perhaps a little bit of recognition, but this is where she lives now. Yet, and this goes back to Václav Havel and the hope, she didn't become bitter. She continues doing what she's doing, and but she's not a market person too, which is another story altogether. Okay, I guess I maybe have only a few more minutes. So Naděžda Plíšková is a relatively recently rediscovered artist who was not only a printmaker, but she was a very talented sculptor, and she also was a poet. So she very often combined her visual art practice with her words, with her text, and sometimes she also used printmaking as sort of the paper for her text. I visited still her studio, which is in her daughter's house, and I chose, these are some of the prints that I saw, and that so directly speak to the role of women, the questions of beauty. The first print sort of suggesting the operation of women's breasts for the man's sort of enjoyment. The second one, Mona Lisa, and putting the hair rolls on her head, sort of saying, well, but she needed to also fix her up before she was painted so that she would be worth the male gaze. She did a series, not series as such, but multiple prints where she also comments on not only women roles, but also consumerism and in the socialist republic, the impact on food, and if the worker is fat, that's sort of the utmost goal. You're fat, you're fine. So in this print, the recipe for a pork mignonette, it's a typical Czech meal that she etched in the plate in a way that you can actually add your side dishes, the potatoes, on it. And later on, you will see that this print can actually be put as a, or considered as a paper sculpture, because you can literally cut out the potatoes and make your little installation. She also worked with screen print, which was something unusual or sort of frowned upon by also her male colleagues, or the tradition of traditionalist printmakers, because screen print was supposed to be mass type of printmaking technique. So that in itself was sort of like a revolt against the canon. This particular work, cross-section of a rose of bouquet, again, it's a very sort of ironic or sarcastic comment about, again, the meat, the red meat. You have pork, you're good, but it's the woman who cuts the meat and prepares it. And what she gets, a bouquet of roses once a year, which very often would be on the International Women's Day, which was famous in the Czech Republic, or that sphere, to be a feast for the men, because they gave women a little carafiat, red carafiat, and they went to have drinking parties, and women went home to take care of them. This is an example of her sculptural work. Earlier you saw the spoon, which actually became also a centerpiece of an exhibition and of a happening in the early of 1970s, which was done again in a private space and all. So I will just bring it out there, but maybe we will have an opportunity to speak more about the sort of the gender roles. The three women and three examples of here are, on the left, Adriana Shimotova, who was a wife and partner of Jiří Jon, again, very well celebrated artist. She lived under his shadows, and even if after he died, she still was considered sort of women whose work, which were mainly paperwork, sculptures, were too feminine, it didn't have enough roughness, and also maybe enough abstraction or geometric abstraction, which sometimes you actually, speaking with some galleries or curators, there is still that sense that it's the sort of the male art that is heavier and more dissident and more underground, which is interesting. Naděžda Plíšková, I just talked about, and Věla Kolářová, wife of Jiří Kolář, that I mentioned earlier, that she also sort of brought the idea of everyday objects and bringing them to the focus of her artwork. This is a snap that you put on, like a button that you put and you snap together to hold a piece of cloth. And in Czech, patentka is feminine. That's how you declinate it. So she called that the biography of the snap that basically was her own biography and expressing her own personality next to the man that she still had to sort of go along, support. And okay, these are the other works by Adriana Shimotova and Věla Kolářová. By the way, also was her earlier practice was making photograms, again, everyday objects that she just lit with light. These are needles, but she also did some action performances and all. And this is the biography of a snap fastener. Zdenka Golob is a Slovenian artist, but I think I'll probably finish here, and maybe some of during the question period I'll be able to share, to elaborate on some of the other comments that I make. Thank you very much for your attention, and I guess Kate and I are ready for questions, or would love to hear comments as well.
Thank you so much, Mila. That was such a pleasure to see all of that artwork. And I can see from the comments that everybody else really enjoyed some of those works. Let me change so I could see everyone. Is there anybody who would like to get started with a question if they're just at the edge of their seats? Or I can also start off. Kate, I was wondering, I was thinking about this paper that you're presenting tomorrow about the like post-performance analysis of pre-performance learning techniques of solo choral music. And I was curious if that impacted the way you think about teaching oral skills and like those beginning learning vocal techniques, particularly in the classroom.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that I am coming to terms with as an educator is that the way that I was educated is not necessarily sufficient or the best or any of these things. And so, in studying music, in a conservatory type environment, we were sort of indoctrinated into a way of talking about music theory and oral skills, which was like, it was a thing that you did and you learned it this way and that was the way, but nobody was really pulling us into like why your oral skills might be important for your performance practice, or for composers especially, like how being able to do transcription or to hear things and be able to label them orally is really helpful for your work as a composer. And so I definitely keep in mind that, at least for me, and I think for a lot of people, the doing of music or the making of music is how we get sucked in. And if that's singing along in your car or playing with an ensemble or whatever it is, it's the doing of it, right? The engaging is what brings music to life, right? It brings the score to life. And it's also a great way of learning. And so I've definitely folded in both conversation about and then the actual doing of making these connections to help make them also just feel a little more important to the students, right? So it's not just a thing you're doing for a class, but it's a thing you're doing in a class that has an application outside of the sort of confines of a music theory course or a composition course.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I see David, you've got your hand up. Would you like to go ahead? Yeah.
Thank you both. So nice for me to be taken to East Central Europe, which is I know other parts of it well, but not the parts that you both were talking about. But I wondered, this is really a question for both of you, if you might talk about ways in which you see your two experiences talking to each other, because what I got out of a lot of Mila's artwork was something sort of happening on the fringes and with very reduced resources, creating certain kinds of really interesting and very beautiful, often, art. And then Kate, I mean, the biggest image I have from what you showed is 75,000 people not looking like they're lacking for at least a certain kind of centrality. They don't seem marginalized in the culture, and all coming together in this very group joyful way, whereas the artists I see doing their own kind of little thing more on the fringes. But clearly there's got to be some commonalities, and I just wondered if you two might comment on how you see that between each other's projects.
Well, maybe I'll just throw the idea of what actually I gathered from Kate's presentation is that the choral, the assembly, it certainly has roots in the folk music, that is the traditional folk music, and I think there I would find commonalities or similarities in the Czech Slovak traditional music as well, that would bring people together, that was not really threatening to the system. In fact, it became, and I'm now speaking just for Czechoslovakia, it became a good and lucrative export to send groups, folkloric groups abroad, even to the Western Europe, and get basically the finances that they wanted. But it was very controlled. But also these music gatherings would be spontaneous. And the other question I actually have is, and that is, I think, the difference, that in Latvia, as in the other Baltic republics, those nations had to fight or keep conscious of their self-determination within the Soviet Union, which was not the case in the Czechoslovakia. It was different. It was political, but we were Czechs and Slovaks, and no one tried to enforce Russian. There was no movement and forced movement of Russians into the society into the Czech Slovak society, whereas in Baltic countries that was the case. They really tried, took people out and sort of resettlements. And I'm sure, Kate, you probably have more to say to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was interesting to see also, Mila, the art that you shared during this, sort of the 60s and 70s. And, if I had shared video of the song celebrations in the 60s and 70s, they looked different. There were still a bunch of people there, but things like traditional costume wasn't allowed, and the conductors leading the concerts were all wearing gray, and they had these sort of very cold outfits, and everything was a little less celebratory. The Soviet government had a really strong hold over the programming in the song celebrations, and so any repertoire that had any mention of any of the individual Baltic nations, like the word Latvia, was not allowed in songs, and so either the song was removed or the words were changed. And I think part of that also sort of leads toward this really interesting engagement with this national repertoire that doesn't really very often explicitly mention Latvia. Like, the repertoire that came out of the occupation often was, a less direct way of engaging with the nation of Latvia, and a more direct way to reach to Latvian culture without sort of engaging the nation. And so, I one of my questions for Mila actually was, what is sort of the, how much do people know and engage with these artists and this art in sort of the present day, right? Or is this a thing that you've sort of gone in and excavated from these archives and brought out? Or are these names sort of commonplace? How sort of, what does it look like now in the present day in terms of how people are engaging? But that can be a question for another time if other people have questions.
I'll be happy to answer unless there are other questions.
You should go ahead. I don't have any on deck.
Okay. Well, this is a generation now of artists who, if they're living, would be in mid-late 80s, and they, right after the changes, that is after the fall of communism in 1989, within like 4 or 5 years or 10 years, they would be curators in galleries that would bring these artists and have exhibitions, so that there was a sense of acknowledgement. But since then, it's basically that for those artists, they might be some regional galleries. So in a way, it sort of gives us a little sad picture, because those artists were not recognized during their lifetime or more productive artistic life, and towards the end of their lives, unfortunately, there is also the element of galleries and market, and the gallerists, as they go where the well, the money would be from the art. So and that obviously is also connected to the global circumstances. The art from between the wars is more known, and so I do believe that these artists would be able to get a little more recognition if they were known more, if they would be someone to really talking about them, exploring them, making analysis, making comparisons. And I'm not saying it's not happening, but where actually I wanted to underline the printmaking activities is because the prints as an art medium is not as promoted or doesn't have the priority as paintings, for example. So even though prints, as I was saying, had the wonderful role as they had through the centuries, they're movable, they can be sent out, they can be, they can be carried along, but it's an individual interest of maybe collectors or people who liked it. So you can actually, you find Alena Kucherova's prints at MoMA, at the Art Institute of Chicago. So they were some interest from the West right after the changes, but those were not seized en masse in the 1990s. And now it's like, it's too late. Now the interest goes somewhere else. But it doesn't mean that we cannot, go back and find a parallel. Like for me, having the Russian collection or collection of Russian and Soviet art just made sense. Okay, well, we can actually see that there was a production right around the corner, and we can add to that. So we can talk, we can expand the narrative, we can expand the visual treasury of it if we get them, and we can get them.
Yeah,
they are out there. And anyway,
I have a comment and question from Olivia. She says, thank you so much, Kate and Mila, for sharing your research with us tonight. One thing I realized while both of you were sharing is that I'm fairly ignorant about the histories around Eastern Europe, and it got me really curious. Mila, I was hoping you could share a little more on how you selected the artists that you chose to do deeper research.
Okay, so on one hand, I knew of several of the artists, certainly Vladimir Boudnik, who also was, he was a legend. So there was a dissident writer who wrote about him. So that was one of my underground sort of activities when I was a young student, getting my hands on this particular book. And so I had my idea about, very romanticized idea about him and all. So I knew of him, and I saw some works early in my professional life. So I knew I was always sort of interested in all. Alena Kucherova, so this is to say that I knew some artists. I knew sort of where to start, and I certainly knew the institutions in Prague, Slovak Republic, and also actually in Slovenia. So that was not, but as I went, then I started, like Nadezhda Pliskova. I have to admit, I didn't know of her. I know of her husband, sculptor. He was sort of the protagonist of the underground sculpture, very heavy. So, but I didn't know. And they were other. So yeah, I did find out more, and I have to underline that too, that there is a generation of young curators, young PhD students, And I saw some of her research being done and being discussed, and going to, like say, Germany, there, going to West Europe, and presenting and sort of giving these artists a due, and doing really a great research, going to the archives, going to the magazine, journals, whatever artists could actually get their hands on, and really opening up the network too. So I'm sure that there will be much more clarifying information, letting us know, letting us understand and know more about these artists. So and back to Olivia, to your question, there are obviously artists also in the other countries, in Hungary, in, well, what used to be Yugoslavia, obviously in Poland. I purposely left the Baltic republics because there is actually a very good book and very good research done, and that's thanks to Zimmerli Museum at Rutgers University. The museum has a great collection of Russian art and also of art from that. So that I sort of didn't need to, or didn't think I would do. But the Balkan countries. And again, it's all under the same umbrella, but it's so different politically, culturally, and also religion. We're dealing, there are other traditions that are sort of coming in. So also what I know, it's different. So it's just also, it's fun, it's interesting, but it's also humbling to see, and sort of starting to see what these people, what these artists were going through. And for women in particular, I really heard some amazing, fascinating stories, and I admire, the strengths and I guess creativity that these people were surrounded by. Thank you for your question.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. I see there's one more from Olivia. She says, I'm curious, this question is for both of you. I'm curious while both you embarked on your research, did you find it difficult? Thank you. I'm curious, while both of you embarked on your research, did you find it difficult to find info archived?
For me, similarly, like I sort of tested the limits of what I could get via interlibrary loan and that sort of thing, and met those limits relatively early on in my research. And so I knew that going to Latvia was going to be necessary, just so I could access certain things, and also because so much isn't digitized. There's literally a cabinet full of these tiny cigarette papers that is the collection, like the first and most established collection of Latvian folk songs in the Latvian Folklore Archives in Riga. Like the guy who did the collection wrote them on all these tiny cigarette papers at the end of the 20th century, and they're stored in a giant wooden cabinet. Like it's both wonderful and so frustrating, because, so much of that research slows down in that sense, just to be able to access things. I also found that, at least for me in the early parts of my research, it was hard to get things out of Latvia. And I think there is a little bit of sort of residual sense of protecting documents and original materials, because especially so much art and music was destroyed during the Soviet occupation, in attempt to sort of Sovietize the Baltic nations. And so the things that did survive are really quite protected, and they don't want them to leave their various archives and institutions. And that also anything that was recreated or sort of built afterward, they're just, careful about it. But that said, once I got there and I was like, hey, I'm interested in doing this project, everybody was so welcoming and so helpful. And so it's, the distance of getting there is complicated and expensive, and the language is complicated. But the sort of, once you're there, everybody was really happy to have somebody who was interested in exploring these things. So a little bit of both for me.
Yeah, I would say similarly. what for me was well, perhaps a little challenging is to find a direct contact. So finding out if the artists were still alive, to if they would be open to visit. And I did find enough works to work with or to see and to be able to analyze, compare and all. But I actually was hungry too, and still am, for the personal, the stories. And that's what I feel is not really being done and recorded, or at least I haven't found much. And it's also something that goes back very long to my cultural anthropologist beginnings, doing ethnographic research and speaking with people. And you learn the details, even though there are questions of memory as well, you know, how much you trust and all. But it seems that the new in the art now, there is very much turn into the contemporary, which makes sense too, because it's been like the sort of spreading the wings of artists, contemporary artists. So the sort of the old generation of artists who were once really innovative and creative and all is we're slowly losing that memory.
I will also add on to that. For me, it's the stories, right? Getting sort of individual contacts and enforcing that a story or an individual memory is an important part of research, and getting people to open up about that was a little difficult for me. But that's also because Latvia is still, especially across generations, struggling with some pretty hardcore gender issues. So it was difficult for me as a young female scholar to come in and try and interview these older male conductors or composers and have them take me seriously. And so that was definitely more of a holdup than any of the archival stuff that I did.
That's very interesting. And again, there's the gender roles are quite amazing in these countries too, and still, you know, how profound they are, and sort of in the contemporary life as well.
Thank you both so much. I really enjoyed this conversation. I think we can wrap it up maybe for this evening. And I just want to say thank you so much, Kate and Mila, for collecting your thoughts on these research and the field notes and spending time sharing it with us tonight. It was really a pleasure to have you both in conversation. And also thank you to Danielle for helping behind the scenes with all the tech. Yeah, have a wonderful night, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you very
Ellen.
much.